The air in the courtroom was suffocating, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a verdict no one wants to hear. News vans lined the street outside. Inside, reporters filled every available seat, their cameras angled toward the defendant's table, where the city's most notorious criminal sat in chains. This wasn't just another murder trial. This was the Dragon of Seoul, Cho Hyun-kai, the man accused of slaughtering an entire family 4 years ago, leaving only one survivor. A 3-year-old girl who hadn't spoken since that blood-soaked night. Today, that girl was 7, and today, she would finally take the stand. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. If you believe the truth can come from the most unexpected places, hit that like button. And subscribe, because this story is about to turn everything you think you know about justice completely upside down. The holding cell beneath the courthouse smelled like rust and bleach, a combination that had become as familiar to Cho Hyun-kai as his own breath. 4 years. 4 years of concrete walls and fluorescent lights that never quite turned off. 4 years of pretending he didn't know why he was still alive when everyone who crossed the syndicate usually wasn't. He sat on the metal bench, wrists already bound, listening to the footsteps above. The bailiffs would come soon. They'd walk him up those stairs, through those doors, and into a room full of people who'd already decided he was guilty. The evidence said so. The city wanted it. The newspapers had been running his photo for weeks with headlines that screamed monster and butcher and dragon's reckoning. Let them think that. It was safer that way. The door clanged open. 2 guards stepped in, their expressions blank, professional. Time to go, Cho. Hyun-kai stood without resistance. He'd learned early that fighting only made the chains tighter. They led him up the narrow stairwell, his shackles clinking with each step, the sound echoing off cinder block walls, through a side door, down a corridor, then through the double doors that opened into the courtroom itself. The reaction was immediate. Camera flashes erupted from the press section despite the judge's previous warnings. Whispers rippled through the gallery like wind through tall grass. Hyun-kai kept his eyes forward, his expression carved from stone. He'd perfected this mask over the years. No emotion, no weakness, nothing they could use against him. They guided him to the defendant's table where his court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man named Gerald Fitzroy, was already shuffling papers. Gerald didn't look up. He never did anymore. Not since Hyun-kai had refused to take the plea deal 3 different times. 25 to life with possibility of parole. Most men would have jumped at it, but Hyun-kai couldn't. Not yet. Not until he knew she was safe. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Brennan entered, her robes sweeping behind her like a storm cloud. The jury filed in next, 12 faces that had already made up their minds during selection. Hyun-kai had watched them during voir dire. The way they looked at his tattoos. The way they flinched when the prosecutor said organized crime and execution-style killing. They didn't see a man. They saw a headline. Sarah Miller stood at the prosecution table, arranging her materials with precise, measured movements. She was good at her job. Hyun-kai had studied her during the preliminary hearings. She believed in the system the way some people believed in religion. Evidence. Procedure. Justice as a formula you could solve if you just had all the right variables. She had no idea she was being played. Judge Brennan's voice cut through the murmurs. The state of New York versus Cho Hyun-kai. Are both sides ready to proceed? The prosecution is ready, Your Honor. Sarah's voice was steady, confident. Gerald cleared his throat. Defense is ready, Your Honor. Very well. Ms. Miller, your opening statement. Sarah stood, buttoning her blazer, and approached the jury box. She spoke clearly, methodically, walking them through the night of the massacre, the Tyler residence, the broken door, the bodies found in the living room, the 3-year-old girl discovered hiding in a closet, covered in her parents' blood, unable to speak. She described the investigation, the fingerprints lifted from the murder weapon, the surveillance footage showing Hyun-kai's vehicle in the neighborhood, the testimony from the task force that linked him to a rival syndicate with motive to eliminate the Tylers, who had been cooperating with federal investigators. The defendant is a professional killer, Sarah said, her gaze sweeping across the jury. He was sent to silence a family, and he did exactly that. The only reason we have any witness at all is because he failed to complete his assignment. Grace Tyler survived not because of mercy, but because of chance. And today, 4 years later, justice will finally catch up to him. She sat down, the courtroom buzzed with approval. This was the narrative they'd been fed for years. Clean, simple, a monster caught. Gerald's opening was shorter, weaker. He talked about reasonable doubt, about the burden of proof, about not rushing to judgment. But even he sounded like he was reading from a script he didn't believe in. When he finished, half the jury was already looking at Hyung Kai like he'd been convicted. Then Judge Brennan said the words that made Hyung Kai's carefully constructed mask almost crack. The prosecution may call its first witness. Sarah stood again. Your Honor, the state calls Grace Tyler to the stand. The doors opened. And that's when everything Hyung Kai had planned for 4 years either came together or fell completely apart. She walked in wearing white, not the black he'd expected, not the dark colors victims wore when they came to point fingers at their nightmares. White, like a blank page, like someone who hadn't decided what story to tell yet. Her hand was wrapped around her social worker's wrist, but her eyes went straight to him. For the first time in 4 years, Cho Hyung Kai felt something break through the mask. Relief, bone-deep, staggering relief. She was alive, she was walking, she was here. The syndicate hadn't found her. The system hadn't broken her. She'd made it to this room, and that meant everything he'd sacrificed had been worth it. But then he noticed something else. Something that made his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with relief. Her cardigan, yellow, bright, unmistakable yellow. The same color as the dragon embroidered on the back of his old jacket. The one he'd wrapped around her that night when the house was burning, and she was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. The jacket the task force had conveniently lost during evidence collection because it would have raised too many questions about why a hitman would give his only protection to his target. She remembered. The social worker tried to guide Grace toward the witness stand, but the girl stopped. Just stopped, her small shoes planted on the polished floor, staring at him like she was looking through time itself. The entire courtroom held its breath. Reporters leaned forward. The jury shifted in their seats. Even Judge Brennan seemed caught in the moment, her gavel resting forgotten in her hand. Grace's lips moved. A whisper, one word. But in that silence, it might as well have been a shout. Dragon. Detective Robert Graves stood near the back of the courtroom, his hand already moving toward his phone. Hyung Kai saw it in his peripheral vision, saw the way Graves' jaw tightened, the way his fingers twitched toward the device in his pocket like he was about to make a call that couldn't wait. That's when Hyung Kai knew. The syndicate was here. They'd been here all along, wearing badges and sitting in places of honor. And they were about to realize that the little girl they'd underestimated 4 years ago was the only person in this room who knew exactly what had happened that night. Grace took a step forward, pulling away from her social worker's grip, then another. She was walking toward the witness stand, but her eyes never left Hyung Kai's face. She was searching for something, confirmation, permission, a sign that it was finally safe to tell the truth. Hyung Kai did the only thing he could. He nodded. Once. So slight that only someone looking for it would catch it. Grace's small hand tightened around her rabbit. And in that moment, Cho Hyung Kai realized that the girl he'd saved 4 years ago was about to save him right back. Grace's shoes made soft, clicking sounds against the marble floor, each step echoing in the suffocating silence. The social worker, a woman named Bate Rodriguez, kept her hand hovering near Grace's shoulder, but didn't touch. They'd learned early that Grace didn't like being held too tightly. Didn't like feeling trapped. The witness stand loomed ahead like a stage neither of them had rehearsed for. Bate helped Grace onto the booster seat, adjusting it so her feet wouldn't dangle quite so helplessly. The stuffed rabbit sat in Grace's lap, its one good eye staring out at the courtroom as if keeping watch. "Place your hand on the Bible, sweetheart," the bailiff said gently. Grace's small hand pressed against the worn leather cover. The bailiff began the oath, his voice softening for a child's ears. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Grace's eyes flickered to Hyung-kai again, then back to the Bible. "I promise." "You may be seated." Sarah Miller approached the stand with the careful movements of someone handling something fragile. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. Child psychologists had coached her on tone, on packing, on how to ask questions that wouldn't re-traumatize. But standing here now, looking at this 7-year-old girl who'd been silent for 4 years, all that preparation felt inadequate. "Grace," Sarah began, kneeling so they were almost eye level, "do you know why you're here today?" Grace nodded slowly. "Can you tell us?" "To talk about the night," Grace said, her voice small but clear. "The night your parents died." Grace's fingers twisted the rabbit's ear. "The night the bad men came." Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was it, the testimony that would seal the conviction. She glanced at her notes, then back at Grace. "Can you tell us what you remember about that night?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting past Sarah to somewhere distant. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Flatter, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized a long time ago. "There was yelling. Daddy told me to hide. I went to the closet. There was a bang, then another bang, then everything smelled like smoke." "And did you see who did this?" Grace's eyes snapped back to the present, focusing with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. "I saw." "Can you point to the person you saw?" This was the moment. The entire case hinged on this identification. Sarah stepped back slightly, giving Grace a clear view of the courtroom, of the defendant's table, of Cho Hyung-kai sitting in his orange jumpsuit, his tattooed neck visible above the collar, his hands cuffed to the metal ring embedded in the table. Grace didn't point. Instead, she stood up on the booster seat, clutching her rabbit, and spoke directly to him. "You told me to count to 100. You said when I got to 100, I could come out, but I counted to 300 because I was scared I counted wrong." The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked down twice, 3 times. "Order! The witness will direct her statements to the court, not to the defendant." But Grace wasn't finished. She climbed down from the seat before Bate could stop her and walked toward the defendant's table. The bailiff moved to intercept, but Judge Brennan held up a hand, her expression caught between protocol and curiosity. Grace stopped 3 feet from Hyung-kai, separated by the low wooden barrier and 4 years of silence. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out something small, something that caught the courtroom lights. A coin, worn and dull, with foreign writing etched into its surface. "You left this in my hand," Grace said, holding it up. "You said it would keep me safe. You said if I ever saw you again, I should show it to you so you'd know I remembered." Sarah's mind was racing, her carefully constructed case crumbling like wet paper. This wasn't in the file. None of this was in the file. She looked to her assistant, then to Detective Graves, who was standing rigid near the back wall, his face drained of color. Hyung-kai stared at the coin, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his mask slipped. His jaw clenched. His eyes glistened. When he spoke, his voice was rough, barely controlled. "You kept it." "You told me to." Gerald Fitzroy was on his feet, sensing an opening he hadn't expected. "Your Honor, if I may." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Brennan said, her attention fixed on the girl. "Ms. Miller, do you wish to redirect?" Sarah approached slowly, her mind still trying to catch up. "Grace, when you say he told you to count, when was this?" "When the house was burning, when the bad men were looking for me." "The bad men," Sarah's throat felt tight. "You mean the defendant?" "No." Grace turned to face her, and there was something in her expression that didn't belong on a 7-year-old's face, something ancient and certain. "He stopped them. He made them go away." The whispers in the gallery grew louder. Reporters were typing frantically. The jury looked confused, skeptical. This wasn't the testimony they'd been promised. This wasn't the scared victim identifying her attacker. This was something else entirely. Sarah glanced at her evidence folder, at the fingerprints, at the weapon, at the forensic timeline that put Hyung-kai at the scene during the murders. "Grace, the police found evidence that he was there, that he had the gun." "He took it away from the other one," Grace said simply. "The one with the badge." The courtroom went absolutely silent. Detective Robert Graves' hand had moved from his pocket to his side, his body language shifting from observer to something more alert, more dangerous. Sarah saw it peripherally, but couldn't process it yet. Her entire focus was on the child in front of her. "Someone else had a badge," Sarah asked carefully. Grace nodded. "He came in after. He said Daddy was a snitch. I didn't know what that meant, but it made the Dragon Man angry." "The Dragon Man?" Grace pointed at Hyung Kai. "He has dragons on his skin. I saw them when he covered me with his jacket. That's how I knew he wasn't one of the bad men. Bad men don't give you their protection." Sarah felt the floor tilting beneath her. 4 years. 4 years of building this case, of relying on forensic evidence that now felt suspect. She turned toward her table, toward the files, and caught Detective Graves' expression. He wasn't pale anymore. He was stone, and his hand was hovering near his hip, where his service weapon would be if he were on duty. Judge Brennan leaned forward. "Ms. Miller, I think we need to examine this testimony more carefully. I'm calling a recess." "Your Honor, I object." Gerald was standing now, his exhaustion replaced with something sharper. "The witness is clearly indicating that my client may have been misidentified. I move to—" "We're in recess, Counselor. 1 hour. Bailiff, return the defendant to holding." The guards moved toward Hyung Kai, but Grace spoke one more time, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Wait." Everyone froze. Grace walked up to the barrier, close enough that she could have touched Hyung Kai's hand if not for the cuffs. She whispered something, just 3 words, too quiet for anyone else to hear. But Sarah saw Hyung Kai's reaction. Saw his eyes close briefly, saw his shoulders drop like he'd been holding up a weight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Then Grace turned and walked back to Bate, slipping her small hand into her social worker's grip. The guards led Hyung Kai out. The gallery exploded with noise. And Sarah stood in the middle of it all, holding a case file that suddenly felt full of lies she'd never thought to question. Detective Graves was gone. His seat at the back was empty. And somehow, that absence felt more damning than anything Grace had said. Sarah pulled out her phone with shaking hands and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in months. A forensic analyst who'd been reassigned suddenly, right after submitting the initial evidence report. The analyst who'd noted irregularities in the fingerprint analysis before being told the case was closed, the evidence was solid, and further review wasn't necessary. The call went straight to voicemail. Sarah looked at the empty witness stand, at the coin Grace had left sitting on the wooden rail, catching the afternoon light. Foreign writing she couldn't read. A promise kept across 4 years and a burning house. In her jacket pocket, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging. The girl doesn't know what she saw." Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned, scanning the courtroom, but whoever sent it was already gone. Or maybe they were still here, watching, waiting to see if she'd take the warning. She looked at the coin again. Then she picked it up. The courtroom didn't just fade. It bled backward, dissolving into the smell of rain and burning wood, into the sound of a door being kicked open with enough force to splinter the frame. 4 years earlier. The Tyler house sat on a quiet street in Queens, the kind of neighborhood where people walked their dogs at night and left porch lights on for each other. Inside, David Tyler was packing the kitchen. His phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. His wife, Monica, stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something together that was already breaking apart. "They promised us protection," David hissed into the phone. "You said if we testified, if we gave you everything, you'd keep us safe." On the other end, whoever was listening offered empty assurances. David hung up and looked at Monica. "Pack a bag. We're leaving tonight." "What about Grace?" "Wake her. We don't have time." But they did have time. Just not enough. 3 blocks away, Cho Hyung Kai sat in a black sedan, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the address written on the back of a business card. He'd been given this job 6 hours ago. Straightforward. Clean. The Tylers had turned federal witness against the Beco syndicate. They'd handed over ledgers, recordings, names. The kind of information that could dismantle decades of carefully constructed operations. The syndicate's response was predictable. Send the dragon. Hyung Kai had done this work before. He was good at it. Efficient. He didn't ask questions about who deserved what. That wasn't his job. His job was to follow orders, collect payment, and move to the next assignment without looking back. But tonight felt different. Tonight, his phone had rung twice with verification calls, once from his handler, once from someone else, someone whose voice he didn't recognize, asking questions that had nothing to do with confirming the hit. Questions about timing, about witnesses, about making sure the message was clear. That's when Hyung Kai realized this wasn't just a job. This was theater, and he was the prop they'd used to scare everyone else into silence. He checked his weapon, a standard-issue pistol registered to a ghost. He tucked it into his jacket and stepped out into the rain. Inside the house, Monica had just reached Grace's bedroom when the lights went out. Not flickering, not a power surge, just dead all at once like someone had cut the line. David grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, his hands shaking. Monica, get Grace now. She scooped up their daughter, who was half asleep, rubbing her eyes and clutching a stuffed rabbit. Mama. SHH, baby. We're going on a little trip. That's when they heard it, the front door handle turning slowly, testing the lock. David moved fast, pushing them toward the back hallway. The closet. Get in the closet and don't make a sound. Monica's eyes were wide with terror. David. Go. She ran, Grace bouncing in her arms, and shoved them both into the hallway closet, pulling the door shut just as the front door exploded inward. Two men entered, not Hyung Kai, two others, dressed in tactical gear but moving wrong, too aggressive, too loud. These weren't professionals. These were executioners putting on a show. David stood in the middle of his living room, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand. Who are you? What do you want? The first man didn't answer. He just raised his weapon and fired. The sound was deafening in the small space. Monica clapped her hand over Grace's mouth to stifle her scream. David went down hard, his body crumpling against the coffee table. The second man moved toward the hallway. Find the wife and kid. That's when Hyung Kai stepped through the broken doorway. He moved differently than the others. Silent. Controlled. His weapon was drawn but lowered, his eyes scanning the scene with the cold assessment of someone who just walked into a situation that had already gone off script. What are you doing? He said quietly. The first man spun, startled. Dragon, we didn't expect. I said, what are you doing? The hit. We're finishing the hit. The hit was one target, federal witness, not his family. The second man laughed, a harsh sound. Orders changed. New boss wants it clean, no loose ends. Hyung Kai's jaw tightened. Who gave that order? Does it matter? We're all getting paid the same. In the closet, Grace's small body was pressed against her mother's chest, both of them trembling. Monica could hear every word through the thin door. She could hear her husband's labored breathing across the room, could hear him trying to say her name through the pain. Then she heard something else, a third voice, calm, professional, coming from the doorway. Gentlemen, let's keep this efficient. Grace shifted slightly, and through the gap in the closet door, she saw him, a man in a suit, tall, clean-cut, with a red tie that seemed too bright for the darkness around him. He stepped over David's body like it was furniture. Is it done? The man in the red tie asked. Almost, just the woman and the kid. Good, make it look like a robbery. Syndicate needs deniability. Hyung Kai's weapon came up, not pointing at the Tylers but at the man in the red tie. Who are you? The man smiled. I'm the insurance policy. You do your job, I make sure nobody looks too closely at how it got done. You're a cop. I'm whatever I need to be. Now finish it, or I'll file a report that says you botched the hit and let a witness survive. How do you think the syndicate handles that kind of failure? The second gunman was moving down the hallway now, toward the closet. Monica felt Grace stiffen in her arms. She wanted to run, to fight, to do something, but there was nowhere to go. The closet door handle started to turn. Hyung-kai made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He shot the second gunman first, center mass. The man went down before he even registered the betrayal. The first gunman spun, his weapon rising, but Hyung-kai was faster. 2 shots, clean, professional. The man dropped. The man in the red tie dove behind the overturned couch, cursing, fumbling for his own service weapon. "You just signed your death warrant." Hyung-kai moved toward the hallway, his focus split between the threat behind him and the closet door ahead. "Get out! Back door! Run!" Monica kicked the closet open and ran, Grace bouncing in her arms, but she only made it 3 steps before the man in the red tie fired. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe. Hyung-kai returned fire, providing cover, but Monica stumbled. Grace tumbled from her arms, hitting the floor hard. "Mama." Monica tried to crawl toward her daughter, blood spreading across her shirt from a wound Monica didn't even feel yet. David was calling her name from the living room, his voice weak. And somewhere in the chaos, accelerant was being poured, a backup plan being executed by someone who'd already left through the back. Hyung-kai reached Grace first. He scooped her up with one arm, his weapon still trained on the man in the red tie who was reloading behind the couch. "Stay down," Hyung-kai said, his voice hard. Then, quieter, to Grace, "Close your eyes." "My mama." "I know, close your eyes." Grace squeezed her eyes shut and felt herself being moved fast, felt the cold rain hit her face as they burst through the kitchen door into the backyard. Hyung-kai set her down behind a shed, shrugging off his jacket and wrapping it around her shaking body. The yellow dragon on the back glowed faintly in the moonlight. "Listen to me," he said, crouching so they were face to face. "You're going to count to 100. You understand? 100. Don't come out until you finish, no matter what you hear." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "If anyone asks what you saw tonight, you say nothing. Nothing, until it's safe." "How will I know when it's safe?" Hyung-kai reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin. Korean, old, the kind his grandmother used to give him before he became something she wouldn't recognize. He pressed it into Grace's small palm. "You keep this. If you ever see me again, you show me this, and I'll know you remembered. I'll know it's time." Time for what? To tell the truth. Behind them, flames were already licking at the kitchen windows. Sirens wailed in the distance. Hyung-kai stood, checking his weapon one more time. "Count! Don't stop counting." He moved back toward the house, but not before Grace whispered, "What's your name?" He paused, looked back. "Dragon." Then he disappeared into the smoke. Grace pressed herself against the shed and started counting. 1, 2, 3. Inside the house, she heard more gunshots, heard shouting, heard her father's voice one last time calling for her mother. 4, 5, 6. By the time she reached 100, the entire first floor was engulfed. Fire trucks were pulling up. Neighbors were running out in their bathrobes, and Grace kept counting. 101, 102, because he told her to, because stopping meant accepting what she already knew. She counted to 300 before the firefighters found her, wrapped in a yellow jacket with a dragon on the back, clutching a coin and a stuffed rabbit, her eyes vacant, her voice gone. And somewhere in the chaos, Detective Robert Graves was already crafting his report. A report that would bury a corrupt cop's involvement and pin everything on the Dragon of Seoul. A report that would send Cho Hyung-kai to prison for 4 years, while the syndicate hunted for the only witness who could unravel their perfect frame job. A 3-year-old girl who wouldn't speak. Who couldn't speak. Until today. The recess lasted 43 minutes. Sarah spent 37 of them locked in a conference room with evidence files spread across the table like a crime scene of their own. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the growing realization that she'd been played. The fingerprints on the murder weapon were too clean. No smudges, no partials, just perfect ridges pressed into the metal like someone had posed them. The blood spatter analysis matched the trajectory reports perfectly, too perfectly, like a textbook example rather than the chaos of actual violence. And the timeline. The timeline that put Hyung-kai at the scene exactly when the murders occurred was based on a single traffic camera that had been conveniently offline for maintenance the day before and the day after. Someone had built this case like a house of cards, and now a 7-year-old girl was about to blow it down. Sarah's phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. The girl is confused. Trauma does that. Don't let her destroy a solid conviction. Sarah stared at the message, then deleted it. But her hand hovered over the contact list, over Detective Graves' name. He'd worked this case from the beginning. He'd been first on scene. He'd personally logged the evidence, interviewed the neighbors, built the forensic timeline that made Hyung-kai's guilt seem inevitable. He'd done everything right. Or everything wrong. The bailiff knocked on the door. 5 minutes, counselor. Sarah gathered her files and walked back into the courtroom, where the gallery had somehow grown even more packed. Word had spread during recess. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. This was something bigger unraveling in real time. Judge Brennan took her seat, her expression grave. Ms. Miller, are you prepared to continue with this witness? Sarah stood. Yes, Your Honor. Grace was already back on the stand, the booster seat adjusted, her rabbit in her lap. Bates sat in the front row now, close enough to intervene if needed. But Grace looked calmer than before, like speaking had lifted something heavy off her chest. Sarah approached slowly, her mind racing through questions she hadn't prepared, through a cross-examination that had suddenly become an investigation. Grace, before the recess, you mentioned a man with a badge. Can you tell us more about him? Grace nodded. He came after the dragon man. He was mad. He said bad words. What kind of bad words? He called my daddy a snitch, and he said something about cleaning up loose ends. The jury shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the narrative they'd been sold. Sarah pressed forward. Did you see this man's face? Not really. I was hiding, but I saw his hand when he reached for his gun. His hand. Grace's eyes brightened slightly, like she'd been waiting for this question. He had a big watch, shiny. It made sounds when he moved. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of sounds? Like clicking. My daddy had a watch like that. He said it was special, mechanical. From the back of the courtroom, someone coughed. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Detective Robert Graves had returned to his seat, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his knees. His left wrist was covered by his sleeve. Sarah made a decision that would either save this case or destroy her career. Your Honor, I'd like to request something unusual. May the witness provide a visual representation of what she remembers. Judge Brennan frowned. Counselor, we're not in art class. With respect, Your Honor, the witness is 7 years old. She's been silent for 4 years. Sometimes children process trauma through imagery rather than words. I'd like to give her that opportunity. Gerald Fitzroy was on his feet. The defense has no objection. In fact, we encourage it. Of course he did. Anything that undermined the prosecution's case was a gift to the defense. Judge Brennan considered for a moment, then nodded. Bailiff, please provide the witness with drawing materials. The bailiff brought a large sketch pad and a box of crayons. Grace's eyes lit up when she saw them, the first genuinely childlike reaction she'd had all day. She climbed down from the booster seat and sat cross-legged on the floor of the witness stand, the pad balanced on her knees. Grace, Sarah said gently, kneeling beside her, can you draw what you remember from that night, the people who were there? Grace selected a black crayon first. She started with the outline of a room, simple rectangular shapes for walls, a door, windows. Then she drew stick figures, 3 of them. She labeled them with careful phonetic spelling. Daddy, Momi, me. Then she picked up a red crayon and drew fire. Not realistic flames, but the way a child would draw them, jagged points shooting up the walls, consuming the simple shapes she'd just created. The courtroom watched in absolute silence. Grace switched to a brown crayon and drew another figure, taller than the others. She added details this time, lines on the neck, tattoos. She labeled this one Dran. That's Hyung-kai, Sarah asked. Grace nodded. Then she picked up a blue crayon and drew 2 more figures. Bigger, blockier. "Bad mans," she wrote beneath them. "These are the men who hurt your parents. They came first, before the dragon. They had big guns." She drew rectangles in their stick-figure hands. Sarah's throat felt tight. "And the man with the badge, can you draw him?" Grace paused, her small hand hovering over the crayon box. She selected a gray one. Slowly, carefully, she drew another figure standing near the door. This one had more detail than the others. She drew a tie first, long and thin, then a jacket. Then, with painstaking precision, she drew a circle on the figure's wrist. "His watch," Grace said softly. "It was big, and it had little circles inside." Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Can you show us what the circles looked like?" Grace leaned over the pad, her tongue poking out in concentration. She drew 3 smaller circles inside the watch face, arranged in a triangle pattern. Subdials, the signature feature of a luxury chronograph. The kind of watch that cost more than a detective's monthly salary. The kind of watch Robert Graves wore every single day. Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She turned to face the gallery, her eyes searching for Graves. He was still sitting in the back row, but his expression had changed. No longer stone, now something closer to trapped. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice barely controlled. "I'd like to request that Detective Robert Graves come forward." The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked down hard. "Ms. Miller, what is the meaning of this?" "Your Honor, the witness has identified a man with a badge and a distinctive watch. Detective Graves was the lead investigator on this case. I believe we need to verify whether the witness is describing him." Gerald was grinning now, barely containing it. "The prosecution is impeaching its own witness chain." "I'm following the evidence, Your Honor." Judge Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Detective Graves, please approach the bench." For a long moment, Graves didn't move. Every eye in the courtroom was on him. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options. Run and look guilty. Stay and face whatever came next. His hand moved to his wrist, adjusting his sleeve, an unconscious gesture that revealed exactly what Sarah needed to see. The watch, silver and black, 3 subdials, mechanical movement that clicked with each sweep of the second hand. Exactly like Grace's drawing. Graves stood slowly and walked down the aisle toward the front. His movements were controlled, professional, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. He stopped at the barrier separating the gallery from the well of the court. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "I'm not sure what the prosecution is implying, but I was the officer who saved this investigation. I was the one who brought the defendant to justice." Sarah picked up Grace's drawing and held it up. "Grace, is this the watch you remember?" Grace looked up from her spot on the floor. Her eyes went to Graves' wrist. She stared at the watch for a long moment, and Sarah could see the memories flooding back. The fear, the confusion, the 4 years of silence that had protected her from having to relive this. Then Grace nodded. "That's it, that's the clicking watch." Graves' jaw tightened. "Your Honor, the child is clearly confused. She was 3 years old, traumatized." "She can't possibly." "I was 3, Grace interrupted, her voice stronger now. "But I'm 7 now, and I remember." She stood up, still holding her drawing, and walked to the edge of the witness stand. She pointed at Graves. "You were there. You said my daddy was a snitch. You said the dragon man should finish the job, but he didn't. He stopped you." The courtroom was chaos now. Reporters were typing frantically. The jury was leaning forward, trying to hear over the noise. Judge Brennan's gavel was slamming repeatedly, barely making a dent in the volume. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, just the sick realization that she'd almost sent an innocent man to prison for life, while the real killer watched from the back row wearing a badge. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise. "I move to suspend these proceedings pending a full investigation into Detective Graves' involvement in the Tyler murders." Graves' hand moved toward his hip, old instinct, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there in a courtroom. The bailiff saw it and moved quickly, positioning himself between Graves and the exit. "Detective," Judge Brennan said coldly, "you will remain in this courtroom. Bailiff, please escort Detective Graves to a holding area while I confer with counsel." Graves didn't fight, but as he was led away, he looked directly at Grace. Not with anger, not with threat, with something worse. Calculation. Like he was already figuring out how to fix this, how to spin it, how to make sure a 7-year-old girl's testimony wouldn't be enough to tear down 4 years of carefully constructed lies. Grace clutched her rabbit tighter and whispered something Sarah almost didn't catch. "He's going to run." And somehow, Sarah knew she was right. The courtroom emptied slowly, like water draining from a cracked vessel. Judge Brennan had called for a 48-hour continuance, while Internal Affairs launched an emergency investigation into Graves' involvement. The media was already spinning the story 6 different ways. Defense attorneys across the city were probably celebrating. And somewhere in a holding cell beneath the courthouse, Robert Graves was sitting in silence, waiting for his union rep and a lawyer who specialized in making problems disappear. Sarah sat alone at the prosecution table long after everyone else had left. Grace's drawing lay in front of her, the crayon watch circled in red evidence marker. A child's testimony. A piece of paper with stick figures, against a decorated detective with 15 years of commendations and a case file that had seemed bulletproof. Had seemed. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her assistant, Kevin. "Check your email. Sent you the original evidence chain documentation. Something's weird." She opened her laptop, the screen glowing harsh in the dimming courtroom. The email contained scanned PDFs of the evidence logs from 4 years ago. Sarah had reviewed these before during trial prep, but she'd been looking for completeness, not inconsistencies. Now she was looking for cracks. The murder weapon, a .45 caliber pistol, had been logged into evidence at 3:47 a.m., 6 hours after the fire was reported. Standard procedure. The fingerprint analysis had been completed by the NYPD forensic lab and filed 2 days later. Clean prints, perfect ridges. Cho Hyung-kai's right index and thumb pressed into the grip exactly where someone would hold it to fire. Too perfect. Sarah zoomed in on the log entries. The weapon had been checked out of evidence exactly once after initial processing, 3 weeks after the murders, by Detective Robert Graves. Reason listed. Additional forensic photography requested by DA's office. Sarah pulled up her case files, searching for any photography requests she'd made. Nothing. She called the DA's office evidence coordinator, a woman named Patricia who'd been there longer than most of the prosecutors. "Patricia, it's Sarah Miller. Sorry to call so late." "No problem, hun. I'm still here. This Graves thing has the whole building upside down." "I need to ask about evidence protocol. If a detective checks out a piece of evidence for additional processing, does that require a request form from the DA?" "Absolutely. We don't let evidence leave the locker without paper trail. Why?" The murder weapon in the Tyler case was checked out by Graves 3 weeks after the murders. The log says it was at our request, but I can't find any documentation. Silence on the other end. Then, "Send me the evidence number. Let me check our database." Sarah read off the number and waited, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could hear Patricia typing, muttering to herself. "That's strange," Patricia finally said. "I'm showing the checkout in the police log, but there's no corresponding request form in our system, and the weapon was out for..." "Sarah, it was out for 6 hours." 6 hours? For photography? Photography takes maybe 30 minutes, an hour if they're being thorough. What was he doing with it for 6 hours? Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Who else had access to the evidence locker that day? According to the sign-in sheet, just Graves and the evidence clerk on duty, a guy named Tommy Reyes. But Tommy died 2 years ago, car accident. Of course he did. Sarah thanked Patricia and hung up. She stared at the evidence log, at the 6-hour gap, and started doing math. 6 hours was enough time to drive to a private facility. Enough time to have prints lifted from a secondary source, a glass, a door handle, anywhere Hyung Kai had touched before his arrest, and transferred to the weapon. Enough time to replace the original weapon with an identical model that told the exact story the syndicate needed. She pulled up the forensic report next. The fingerprint analysis had been signed by Dr. Helen Cortez, a veteran examiner with an impeccable reputation. But Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. The report had been amended. Once, a week after initial filing. A single line added to the notes section. Prints confirmed via secondary AFIS scan for verification. Secondary scan. Sarah opened a new search window and typed in forensic fingerprint fraud secondary verification. The results made her chest tighten. Secondary scans were sometimes used to mask manipulation. If you altered a print, ran it through an automated system, and then claimed you were just verifying the original analysis, it buried the tampering under layers of legitimate procedure. Her phone buzzed, not a text this time, a call from an unknown number. Sarah almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Miller," a woman's voice, shaky, scared. "Who is this?" "Dr. Helen Cortez. I think we need to talk." Sarah's breath caught. "Dr. Cortez, if this is about the Tyler case." "It is, and I'm probably making a mistake calling you, but I've been watching the news. That little girl, what she said about Graves." A pause. "I need to tell you something I should have said 4 years ago." "I'm listening." "Not on the phone. Can you meet me? Tonight?" Sarah checked her watch. Almost 9 p.m. "Where?" "My office. NYU Medical Center Forensic Wing, 10th floor. I'll leave your name at the desk." "Dr. Cortez, if you're in danger." "Just come, please." The line went dead. Sarah sat in the empty courtroom for another moment, weighing the decision. This could be a setup. It could be paranoia. Or it could be the break that would finally crack this case open completely. She grabbed her bag and headed for the exit. The parking garage beneath the courthouse was nearly empty, just a handful of vehicles scattered across the dim concrete expanse. Sarah's heels echoed as she walked toward her sedan, her keys already in her hand. She clicked the unlock button, and the car's lights flashed. That's when she noticed the SUV parked 3 spaces down, engine running, windows tinted, no plates. Sarah's hand tightened around her keys, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. She could go back inside, find a security guard, wait for the vehicle to leave. But if she was being paranoid, if this was just someone making a phone call or waiting to pick someone up, she'd look like a scared prosecutor who couldn't handle pressure. She opened her car door and slid inside, locking it immediately. Started the engine, checked her mirrors. The SUV hadn't moved. Sarah pulled out of her space and headed toward the exit ramp. In her rear view, the SUV's headlights flicked on. It followed her. Not closely, keeping 2 car lengths back, professional distance. The kind of surveillance that wanted her to know she was being watched without making it easy to prove. Sarah's mind raced. She could drive to a police station, but which officers could she trust? She could call 911, and report what? A car driving in the same direction. She merged onto the street and headed north toward NYU Medical Center. The SUV stayed with her. 3 traffic lights, 4 turns. The SUV matched every move. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed Kevin. "I need you to do something for me right now." "What's wrong? You sound." "I'm being followed. Black SUV, no plates. I'm heading to NYU Medical to meet with Dr. Cortez, the forensic examiner. If you don't hear from me in 2 hours, call Internal Affairs and tell them everything." "Sarah, maybe you shouldn't." "Just do it, Kevin." She hung up and focused on driving. The medical center was 15 minutes away. 15 minutes where anything could happen. She thought about Graves in that holding cell, about whoever sent those threatening texts, about a syndicate that had successfully framed a man for 4 years and wouldn't hesitate to protect that investment. The SUV was still there when she pulled into the medical center parking structure. Sarah found a space near the elevators, in a well-lit area with security cameras visible. She sat in her car for a moment, watching the SUV cruise past and disappear around a corner. She got out quickly and headed for the elevators, her hand hovering near her phone, ready to call for help if needed. The elevator ride to the 10th floor felt like it took an hour. When the doors opened, she found herself in a quiet hallway lined with office doors and research labs. Dr. Cortez's office was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, light spilling out into the corridor. Sarah approached slowly. "Dr. Cortez." No answer. Sarah pushed the door open wider. The office was small, cluttered with case files and forensic journals. A computer sat on the desk, its screensaver dancing with geometric patterns. And in the chair behind the desk sat Dr. Helen Cortez, her head tilted back, her eyes open but seeing nothing. A coffee cup sat on the desk beside her, still steaming. Sarah's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone to call 911. But before she could dial, she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, coming fast. She looked back at Dr. Cortez's lifeless eyes and understood with terrible clarity. This wasn't a meeting. This was a message. The footsteps were getting closer. Sarah grabbed the coffee cup with a tissue, careful not to touch it directly, and shoved it in her bag. Then she spotted what she'd really come for, a flash drive, sitting partially hidden under a stack of papers. She took that, too. The footsteps were right outside now. Sarah looked around frantically. The office had one window, 10th floor, no fire escape. The door was the only exit, and whoever was coming was about to block it. She did the only thing she could think of. She pulled out her phone, opened the video camera, and pressed record. Then she stepped behind the door, pressed herself against the wall, and waited. The door swung open. 2 men entered. Not cops, not security. They wore maintenance uniforms, but they moved wrong. Too alert, too tactical. One of them saw Dr. Cortez and cursed. She called someone, check her phone. The other man moved to the desk, pulling on latex gloves. That's when Sarah realized she had maybe 10 seconds before they found her. She hit send on the video, uploading it to the cloud, to Kevin, to her personal email. Anywhere it might survive if she didn't. Then she stepped out from behind the door and said the only thing that might keep her alive. "I already have everything, and if I don't check in within the hour, it all goes public." The men turned. One of them smiled. It wasn't a comforting expression. "Ms. Miller, we've been hopping to talk to you." The 2 men in maintenance uniforms didn't advance immediately. They stood in the doorway of Dr. Cortez's office, blocking Sarah's only exit, their expressions carefully neutral. The one who'd smiled, older, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, tilted his head slightly. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, counselor." Sarah's hand tightened around her phone, the flash drive from Dr. Cortez's desk burning like hot metal in her jacket pocket. "I've already sent the files. Video too. You touch me, and everyone will know." "Everyone already knows," the second man said. He was younger, built like someone who spent serious time in a gym. "That's the problem. You're asking questions that lead to uncomfortable places." Questions like why Detective Graves checked out the murder weapon for 6 hours, or why Dr. Cortez was about to tell me the fingerprints were forged. The older man's smile faded. "Dr. Cortez had a heart condition, very sad. These things happen." Sarah glanced at the body slumped in the chair, at the steaming coffee cup she'd grabbed. She was poisoned. "Prove it." "I will. The cup is already in evidence." That got a reaction, just a flicker but enough. The older man's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing." "Try me." They stood in silence for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then the older man's radio crackled. A voice Sarah couldn't make out, urgent and low. The man listened, then looked at his partner. "We're done here, for now." They left without another word, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Sarah waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, then ran. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, her heels pounding down 10 flights, her breath ragged by the time she burst into the parking structure. The SUV was gone. Sarah drove straight to the police commissioner's office and spent the next 4 hours giving a statement, turning over the flash drive, and explaining why a forensic examiner was dead in her office hours after promising to expose evidence tampering. By the time she left, dawn was breaking over Manhattan, and Sarah hadn't slept in 26 hours. But she had something now, proof, or the beginning of it. The flash drive contained Dr. Cortez's original analysis, the one filed before the amended version. The one that flagged the fingerprints as inconsistent with natural deposition and recommended further examination for possible transfer contamination. That recommendation had been ignored, overridden, buried under a secondary analysis that confirmed what the case needed: Cho Hyung-kai's guilt. Sarah got 3 hours of sleep on her office couch before her phone woke her. Kevin, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to get to the courthouse, now." "What happened?" "Grace Tyler is here. She showed up with her social worker an hour ago, saying she wants to testify again. Judge Brennan is convening an emergency session." Sarah's exhaustion evaporated. Did Graves make bail? "No, he's still in holding, but Sarah, there are people here, a lot of people, and some of them don't look like press." Sarah grabbed her jacket and ran. The courthouse was chaos when she arrived. Security had been tripled, metal detectors backed up with lines stretching out the door, and uniformed officers stationed on every floor. Sarah flashed her credentials and pushed through, taking the stairs to the third-floor courtroom where the Tyler trial had become something nobody could ignore anymore. She found Grace sitting in the witness preparation room with Bate, her social worker. The little girl was coloring again, her rabbit propped against a box of tissues. She looked up when Sarah entered. "Hi, Miss Sarah." Sarah knelt beside her. "Grace, you don't have to do this today. We can wait until—" "I want to finish," Grace said simply. "I want to tell the rest." "The rest?" Grace held up her drawing. This time it wasn't stick figures. It was a building, the courthouse, and inside she'd drawn something that made Sarah's blood run cold. A chandelier, falling, and beneath it 2 figures, one large, one small. "Grace, what is this?" "A dream I had last night. The bad men want to stop me from talking, but the dragon will protect me. That's what he does." Sarah looked at Bate, who shrugged helplessly. "She's been drawing that since 5 this morning. I thought it was just anxiety about coming back." Sarah studied the image more carefully. Grace had drawn the chandelier's cables with unusual detail for a 7-year-old, and in the corner of the page, barely visible, was a figure with a tool. "Who's this person, Grace?" "I don't know, they're too far away, but they're cutting the strings." A knock on the door, the bailiff. "5 minutes, counselor. Judge Brennan wants everyone in position." Sarah stood, her mind racing. She pulled out her phone and texted building security, "Check the courtroom chandelier. Now." Then she walked into the courtroom, where the gallery was packed even tighter than before. Reporters, spectators, and others, men in suits who sat too still, who watched too carefully. Sarah spotted at least 3 she recognized from organized crime case files. The syndicate was here. Hyung-kai was brought in next, his chains rattling, his expression unreadable. But when Grace entered the courtroom, something changed in his posture. He sat up straighter, his eyes tracking her movement across the floor, not with threat, with vigilance. Like he was scanning for danger she couldn't see yet. Grace took the stand again, settling into the booster seat like she was coming home. Judge Brennan leaned forward. "Grace, I understand you have more to share with us." "Yes, ma'am, I remembered something else, about the fire." Sarah stood. "Your Honor, before the witness continues, I'd like to request a brief security check of the courtroom." Judge Brennan frowned. "On what grounds?" "The witness has expressed concerns about her safety. Given recent events involving Detective Graves and Dr. Cortez, I believe those concerns are justified." The judge's expression darkened. "Bailiff, please coordinate with building security for a sweep. We'll proceed once they've cleared the room." That's when the lights flickered. Just once, a brief interruption that most people barely noticed, but Sarah saw Hyung Kai's reaction. His head snapped up, his eyes going to the ceiling, to the ornate crystal chandelier hanging directly above the center aisle. Directly above the path Grace would take to leave the courtroom. "Everyone stay seated," the bailiff ordered, already moving toward the doors. The second flicker lasted longer, 3 seconds of darkness before the light struggled back on, and in that darkness, Sarah heard it. A sound like a cable under tension, a groan of metal giving way. "Get her out," Hyung Kai's voice cut through the confusion, raw and desperate. "The chandelier." No one moved fast enough. The bailiff was still 20 feet away. Bate was frozen in her seat. Sarah was already running, but she was too far. Hyung Kai moved. He lunged forward, his chains snapping taut against the table's anchor ring, his shoulder dislocating with an audible pop as he wrenched himself forward. The chains held. He couldn't reach Grace, but he threw himself sideways anyway, his body becoming a shield between the little girl and whatever was about to fall. The chandelier dropped. 300 pounds of crystal and iron, plummeting from 30 feet up. It missed Grace by inches, crashing into the floor where she'd been standing half a second before. Shards of crystal exploded outward like shrapnel. The impact shook the entire room. Grace was on the ground, covered by Bates' body. The social worker had finally moved, diving across the witness stand to grab her. But it was Hyung Kai's lunge that had bought them the split second they needed. His warning that had broken through the shock. Silence. Then chaos. Security flooded in. Judge Brennan was shouting orders. The gallery erupted into panic, people pushing toward the exits. Sarah fought her way through to Grace, who was shaking but unharmed. "I'm okay," Grace whispered. "He warned us just like the dream." Sarah looked at Hyung Kai, who was being forced back into his seat by 3 guards, his shoulder hanging at a wrong angle, his face pale with pain. Their eyes met across the wreckage. He nodded once. Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the photo she'd taken of Grace's drawing. The chandelier, the cut cables, the figure in the corner with a tool. She looked up at the ceiling at the severed cables still dangling from the mounting bracket. Not frayed, not worn, cut, cleanly, deliberately. Someone had sabotaged the chandelier. Someone who knew Grace would be standing beneath it. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from building security. "Maintenance logs show electrical work scheduled in that courtroom this morning, but we didn't authorize any work. The crew that signed and used stolen IDs. We're reviewing footage now." Sarah's hands were shaking as she typed back, "Who authorized the work order?" The response came 30 seconds later. "Detective Robert Graves. Submitted yesterday, 3 hours before he was taken into custody." Sarah looked across the courtroom to where Graves sat in the gallery, flanked by his attorney and 2 federal marshals. He was staring at Grace with an expression that wasn't quite rage, wasn't quite fear. It was calculation. He'd known, he'd planned this before he was arrested. A contingency, a final solution to silence the one witness who could destroy him. And he'd almost succeeded. Grace climbed to her feet, brushing crystal dust from her dress. She looked at the wreckage of the chandelier, then at Hyung Kai, then at Sarah. "Can I keep talking now?" she asked. "I still have more to say." Judge Brennan, still pale from the near miss, nodded slowly. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour, in a different courtroom, with full security detail." As they filed out, Sarah caught Hyung Kai's eye one more time. His shoulder was clearly dislocated, his face tight with pain, but he wasn't asking for medical attention. He was watching the exits, watching the faces in the crowd. Still protecting her, even from inside a cage. And Sarah realized something she should have understood from the beginning. Cho Hyung Kai had never stopped being Grace's guardian. Prison hadn't been punishment. It had been his fortress. The one place the syndicate couldn't kill him while he waited for the day Grace would finally be ready to speak. That day was today. And someone was willing to bring down a courthouse to stop it. The new courtroom was smaller, windowless, buried on the second floor where a falling chandelier couldn't reach. Security had swept it 3 times. Officers stood at every entrance. And still, Sarah felt like they were sitting in a trap waiting to spring. She'd sent Grace and Bate home under protective custody. The girl had wanted to stay, but Sarah convinced her they needed time to prepare. Time to make sure the next session wouldn't end with another attempt on her life. What Sarah really needed was time to find the smoking gun. She sat in her office that evening surrounded by evidence boxes she'd requisitioned from storage. 4 years of investigation, all pointing to one man, except now she knew it had been pointing the wrong way on purpose. Kevin knocked and entered without waiting, his arms full of more files. I pulled everything from the original scene investigation. Photos, witness statements, evidence logs, and this. He held up a clear evidence bag containing a cell phone, old model, flip phone, the kind people used when they didn't want smartphones tracking their every move. What is it? David Tyler's burner. He was using it to communicate with his federal handler. It was found in the wreckage, damaged by fire and water from the sprinklers. The forensics team couldn't pull anything from it 4 years ago. Sarah took the bag, studying the charred device. Why are you showing me this now? Because technology's improved. I called in a favor with a data recovery specialist. He thinks he might be able to extract something if the SIM card survived. Kevin paused. It's a long shot, but if David Tyler recorded anything that night. Sarah was already reaching for her coat. Where's the specialist? Brooklyn. His shop closes at 9. They made it with 15 minutes to spare. The shop was tucked between a bodega and a laundromat, its windows covered with posters advertising unlocking services and screen repairs. Inside, a young man with multiple piercings and a hoodie that read, I void WARRANTIS, looked up from a disassembled laptop. You the prosecutor? Sarah nodded. You're Marcus. Mark. Nobody calls me Marcus except my mom. He held out his hand for the evidence bag. This the phone. Sarah handed it over, watching as Mark examined it under a magnifying lamp. He whistled low. This thing's been through hell. You're lucky it's an older model. Newer phones, the encryption would be toast. But this, he pried open the back with a specialized tool. The SIM might have survived. 20 minutes later, Mark had the SIM card connected to a reader, running recovery software that looked like something from a spy movie. Sarah and Kevin stood behind him, watching lines of code scroll across the screen. Got something, Mark said. Partial data recovery. Looks like. Text messages mostly corrupted. Call log is intact, though, and... He paused, his fingers flying across the keyboard. There's a voicemail. Saved to the device, not the carrier network. That's why it survived. Sarah's pulse quickened. Can you play it? Give me a sec. Audio file is fragmented. Need to reconstruct it. The wait felt eternal. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. If David Tyler had recorded something that night, if he'd captured evidence of who really orchestrated the hit. Okay, got it. Audio quality's going to be rough. Lots of ambient noise, some corruption, but it's there. Mark hit play. Static filled the small shop. Then voices, distant and distorted, fighting through the degradation. Told you this needed to be clean, a man's voice, angry. It is clean. Tyler's cooperating with the feds, his wife knows too much, and the kid. A second voice, calmer, more controlled. Sarah leaned closer to the speaker. There was something familiar about that second voice. Don't care about the details. Just make sure there's no blowback. The syndicate's paying good money for this to look like a rival hit. And the dragon. He'll take the fall. Already been positioned. Fingerprints, timeline, motive. By the time anyone asks questions, he'll be in a cage and we'll be counting our retirement money. Sarah's hands were shaking. Kevin gripped her shoulder. The first voice spoke again, clearer this time. What if he doesn't go along with it? Then he joins the Tylers. Either way, this ends tonight. There was a pause, the sound of movement, maybe footsteps. Then the second voice again, and this time it was crystal clear, every word cutting through the static like a knife. I didn't spend 15 years building my reputation to let some civilian snitch tear it down. David Tyler dies tonight. His wife dies tonight. And that little girl, well, no witnesses means no problems. The voice was unmistakable now. Detective Robert Graves. The recording continued. More fragments, the sound of a door opening. David Tyler's panicked breathing as he hid the phone somewhere, maybe behind a couch cushion or under a table. His whispered prayer. Then gunshots. Screaming, the roar of fire. And through it all, Graves' voice, directing the scene like a conductor leading an orchestra of violence. The recording cut out. Sarah stood frozen, the weight of what she'd just heard pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just evidence of corruption. This was premeditated murder. Conspiracy. The hero cop of New York City planning the execution of a witness and his family. "Copy that file," she said, her voice barely steady. "Multiple backups, cloud storage, external drives, everything." Mark nodded, already working. "You want me to testify about chain of custody?" "You're going to be my star witness." Kevin was pale. "Sarah, if Graves finds out we have this." "He already knows we're digging. That chandelier wasn't a warning. It was an execution that failed." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the FBI. This is beyond local jurisdiction now." She dialed the number for the New York field office, asked for the Organized Crime Division, and spent the next 30 minutes explaining everything while Mark created 7 copies of the audio file, each one encrypted and distributed to different secure locations. By the time Sarah left the shop, federal agents were already mobilizing. A task force was being assembled. Warrants were being drafted. And somewhere in a holding cell, Robert Graves was about to learn that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing. But Sarah's victory felt hollow, because David Tyler had recorded that conversation. He'd known he was in danger. He'd tried to create evidence, and it hadn't saved him. She drove back to her office, Kevin following in his own car, both of them checking their mirrors every 30 seconds. The SUV from the parking garage hadn't reappeared, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back. She pulled into the courthouse parking structure and sat in her car for a moment, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, like she'd aged 5 years in 5 days. Her phone rang, unknown number. Sarah almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Miller," a man's voice, not threatening, almost respectful. "You should stop now." "Who is this?" "Someone who's been watching this play out. You've done good work. You've exposed Graves. That's enough. Walk away." "People are dead. A child almost died today. I'm not walking away." "Then you're going to join them." Still calm, still respectful, like he was discussing the weather. "Graves was a small part of something much larger. You're pulling on a thread that's going to unravel the whole city. Judges, prosecutors, police commissioners, people you trust, people you work with every day." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "If they're corrupt, they deserve to fall." "Maybe, but you won't live to see it. Neither will the girl. Neither will the dragon sitting in his cell, thinking he's kept her safe all this time." A pause. "He hasn't. He's just delayed the inevitable, and you're accelerating it. You're threatening a federal prosecutor." "I'm offering advice. You've won. Graves will go down for the murders. The case against Cho Hyung-kai will collapse. Justice served. Take the win and stop asking who else was involved." "No." Silence on the other end, then a sigh. "I really hoped you'd be smarter than this, Ms. Miller. For what it's worth, I respect your integrity. I just wish you'd valued your life more." The line went dead. Sarah sat in the darkness of the parking garage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at her phone, at the recording Mark had sent her, at the evidence that would destroy Graves and crack open a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government. She thought about Grace, 7 years old, finally finding her voice after 4 years of silence. She thought about Hyung-kai, who'd spent 4 years in a cage to keep that little girl alive. And she thought about David and Monica Tyler, who'd tried to do the right thing and been murdered for it. Sarah grabbed her bag and headed for the elevator. She had work to do. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching. Someone who'd already decided she was a problem that needed solving. The elevator doors opened. Sarah stepped inside and pressed the button for her floor. And in her pocket, her phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number. One sentence, no punctuation, just a simple statement of fact. We know where Grace lives. The elevator doors closed, and Sarah stood alone in the ascending box, clutching evidence that could save an innocent man and destroy a corrupt system. If she lived long enough to use it. The federal task force moved Grace to a safe house in New Jersey at 3 a.m. Bate went with her, along with 2 FBI agents and a security detail that included former Secret Service. Sarah had demanded updates every 2 hours. The last text had come at dawn. She's safe, making pancakes and asking about the dragon. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in her office with Kevin and 2 FBI agents, preparing for what would either be the most important testimony of her career or the moment everything fell apart. Because Cho Hyung-kai had agreed to take the stand. Not to defend himself, not to proclaim innocence, to burn down the entire syndicate that had framed him. Gerald Fitzroy had fought it. "You realize this is insane," he'd said during the emergency meeting. "The moment he admits to anything, even crimes outside this case, the jury will crucify him." "Then let them," Hyung-kai had replied calmly. "I'm not walking out of here clean. I stopped pretending that was possible 4 years ago." "You could take a deal. Federal protection, reduced sentence." "I don't want protection. I want them exposed. Every name, every crime, everything they've buried." Hyung-kai had looked at Sarah then, his dark eyes unreadable. "That little girl broke 4 years of silence to save me. I can return the favor." Now, sitting in the same windowless courtroom where a chandelier had nearly killed them all, Sarah watched as Hyung-kai was brought in. His shoulder had been reset, strapped in a medical sling. His chains had been reinforced after his lunge to save Grace. He moved stiffly, painfully, but his expression remained carved from stone. Judge Brennan took her seat, her face drawn with exhaustion. The past 48 hours had aged everyone in this room. "Mr. Fitzroy, I understand your client wishes to testify." Gerald stood reluctantly. "Yes, Your Honor, against my strong advice." "Noted for the record. Mr. Cho, you understand you'll be subject to cross-examination." Hyung-kai nodded. "I understand." "Then please take the stand." The bailiff administered the oath. Hyung-kai placed his hand on the Bible with his good arm and swore to tell the truth. Sarah wondered if he'd ever sworn that oath before, if truth had ever mattered in his world until a 3-year-old girl hiding in a closet made it the only thing that did. Gerald approached, looking like a man walking to his own execution. "State your name for the record." "Cho Hyung-kai." "And what is your occupation?" A pause, then, "I was an enforcer for the Biko syndicate. I killed people for money." The courtroom went silent. The jury sat forward. Even the reporters stopped typing. Gerald closed his eyes briefly, then pressed on. "How many people?" 17 that I'm certain of. Maybe 21, if you count the ones where I wasn't the primary, just backup. Sarah felt sick, but this was the strategy. Hyung-kai wasn't here to be likable. He was here to be honest. Brutally, devastatingly honest. "And the Tyler family, were they one of your assignments?" "Yes." "Did you kill David and Monica Tyler?" "No." Gerald walked to the evidence table and picked up Grace's drawing. "Who did?" "2 contractors hired by the syndicate. Their names were Victor Kozlov and Danny Chin. Both are dead now. Kozlov died in a prison fight 6 months after I was arrested. Chin overdosed 3 weeks later." Hyung-kai's voice was flat, clinical. "The syndicate doesn't leave loose ends." "But you're still alive." "Because I'm in a cage where they can see me, because killing me would raise questions, and because for 4 years they thought I was neutralized." Hyung-kai looked directly at the jury. They were wrong. Gerald glanced at his notes, clearly improvising now. "You were sent to kill the Tylers. Why didn't you?" Because I'm a monster with limits. Hyung-Kai's jaw tightened. I've killed rivals, I've killed traitors, I've killed people who knew exactly what world they were living in. But a 3-year-old girl hiding in a closet, he shook his head. That's not enforcement, that's extermination. And I wasn't going to let that happen. So you stopped the hit. I tried. Kozlov and Chin had already killed the parents by the time I arrived. They were looking for the girl. I shot them both and got her out before the fire spread. The fire that was used to cover the murders. Yes, arson was part of the plan. Make it look like a rival hit gone wrong. Burn the evidence. The girl wasn't supposed to survive. Gerald picked up another document. According to the evidence, your fingerprints were on the murder weapon. They were, because I took the gun away from Chin after I shot him. I didn't know at the time that they'd use that against me, that the whole hit was designed to put me in this room. Who designed it? Hyung-Kai looked past Gerald to the gallery, where federal agents had replaced the spectators. This wasn't a public trial anymore. This was a debriefing disguised as testimony. Detective Robert Graves. He approached the syndicate 6 months before the Tyler hit, offered to handle problems in exchange for payment. The Tylers were his first big job. He helped plan the scene, provided access to evidence storage, and doctored the forensic reports to frame me. Sarah stood. Your Honor, I have the forensic examiner's original report, the audio recording from David Tyler's phone, and testimony from data recovery specialists. I'd like to enter them into evidence. So ordered. Gerald continued. Why would the syndicate agree to frame you? Weren't you valuable to them? I was expensive, and I'd been pushing back on assignments, questioning orders. They saw an opportunity to replace me with someone more compliant and tie up their Graves problem at the same time. 2 birds, 1 bullet. And you've been in prison for 4 years because in here, I knew Grace was safe. Out there, I'd be dead within a week and she'd be the next target. The syndicate doesn't forgive witnesses. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen. Gerald took a breath. Mr. Cho, you've admitted to multiple murders. You're testifying against yourself. Why? Because Grace Tyler spent 4 years silent and terrified, waiting for the day she could speak without getting killed for it. Because Sarah Miller risked her career and her life digging through lies to find the truth. Because sometimes the only way to burn down something rotten is to start the fire yourself. He turned to face the jury directly. I'm not a good man. I've done things that should put me in this cage for life, but I didn't kill the Tylers, and I won't let a corrupt cop and a criminal syndicate murder a child and call it justice. Sarah stood again. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to cross-examine. Judge Brennan nodded. Sarah approached the stand, her mind racing through the questions that would either solidify this case or shatter it. Mr. Cho, you claim Detective Graves approached the syndicate. How do you know this? I was in the room when they discussed it. The syndicate doesn't trust easily. They wanted me to vet him, make sure he wasn't working undercover. And your assessment? He was legitimate, greedy, arrogant, and legitimate. He'd already done smaller favors, tipping them off about raids, losing evidence on minor cases. The Tyler hit was his audition for something bigger. Sarah picked up the audio recording transcript. On this recording, Graves mentions retirement money. Do you know what he was referring to? A long-term payment plan. The syndicate was setting him up as their inside man at NYPD. Monthly deposits to an offshore account, escalating with each successful job. The Tyler hit was worth $200,000. I don't know what they paid him for the chandelier. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Sarah pressed on. You mentioned other names, the syndicate leaders. Who are they? This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Hyung-Kai pulled a folded piece of paper from his sling. How it had gotten past security, Sarah would never know. He unfolded it carefully with one hand. I've memorized the syndicate's hierarchy. 15 key players, 7 of whom operate inside legitimate businesses, 3 inside city government. He looked at the federal agents. I can name them all. I can tell you where they operate, how they launder money, which judges they own, which prosecutors take bribes." An agent in the front row leaned forward. "Why now? Why not 4 years ago?" "Because 4 years ago, they would have killed Grace to discredit my testimony, called her a traumatized child manipulated by a desperate criminal. But now—" Hyunkai's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Now she's spoken first. Now she's the credible witness. I'm just the monster confirming her story." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. He'd planned this. Every move, every silence, every year in prison. He'd been waiting for Grace to be old enough, strong enough, safe enough to speak first. He'd sacrificed himself to give a 7-year-old girl time. "Mr. Cho," Sarah said quietly, "you're confessing to crimes that will add decades to your sentence, crimes outside the Tyler case. Why?" "Because some things are more important than freedom. And because that little girl in the yellow cardigan deserves to grow up in a city that isn't run by people like me." He held up the paper. "I have names, I have dates, I have bank accounts and meeting locations and burial sites. The syndicate destroyed my life to cover their operation. I'm returning the favor." Sarah took the paper, her hands trembling. At the top, in neat handwriting, was a list of 17 names. 3 of them were sitting in this courtroom right now. The paper felt like it was burning through Sarah's fingers. 17 names, 3 in this room. She looked up from the list, her eyes scanning the courtroom. Federal agents lined the walls, but so did others. Court officers, observers, people who'd been fixtures in this building for years. Any one of them could be on Hyunkai's list. Judge Brennan leaned forward. "Ms. Miller, do you have further questions for this witness?" Sarah's mind raced. She could end the examination now, turn the list over to the FBI, let them make the arrests quietly. Clean, professional, safe. Or she could do what Grace had done. Speak the truth out loud where everyone could hear it. "Your Honor, I need to confer with the witness about these names before proceeding." Denied. Whatever information the witness has can be provided in a sealed deposition with federal oversight. We're not turning this courtroom into a circus. Hyunkai's voice cut through. "With respect, Your Honor, the syndicate has been using this courthouse as their personal circus for years. I think it's time the audience saw the real show." "Mr. Cho, you will address the court properly or—" "One of the names on that list," Hyunkai continued, his tone steady but sharp, "is the person who authorized the chandelier maintenance. The person who made sure Grace Tyler would be standing in exactly the right spot when it fell. And they're in this room right now." The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Brennan's face went pale. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious crime." Sarah's eyes went back to the list. She scanned the names, her breath catching when she reached the 5th one. Thomas Landry, Court Security Chief. She looked toward the back of the courtroom where Landry stood near the main entrance, his uniform pristine, his hand resting casually on his radio. He'd been with the courthouse for 12 years. Commendations for bravery. The kind of man everyone trusted with their lives. The kind of man no one would suspect. Before Sarah could speak, the courtroom doors opened. Bate entered with Grace in tow, both accompanied by FBI agents. Sarah's heart lurched. They weren't supposed to be here. The safe house was protocol. Bate looked panicked. "Your Honor, I tried to explain that court wasn't in session for her, but she insisted." "I have to finish," Grace said, her small voice carrying across the silent room. "I have to tell them all of it." Judge Brennan softened slightly. "Grace, you've already testified. You've been very brave." "But I didn't tell them about the 3rd man, the one who held the door." Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. "Grace, what do you mean?" Grace walked down the center aisle, her rabbit tucked under one arm, her eyes scanning the room. She moved past the prosecution table, past the jury box, her gaze searching. That night, when the house was burning, someone held the door closed. From the outside. My mama tried to run out the back, but the door wouldn't open. She was pushing and pushing, but someone was holding it. The courtroom was frozen. everyone watching this 7-year-old girl relive the night her parents died. The dragon man, he had to break the window to get me out, and when we went through, I saw him, the one holding the door. He was wearing a uniform, dark blue, with a badge that was different from the police badges. Sarah's throat went dry. Different how? It had a shield on it, and words I couldn't read yet, but I can read now. Grace stopped walking. She was standing in the center of the courtroom, equidistant from the defendant's table and the back wall. Her eyes locked onto someone near the entrance. It said court security. Thomas Landry didn't move. His expression remained neutral, professional. But Sarah saw his hand shift from his radio to his belt, toward the weapon holstered there. "Grace," Sarah said carefully, "can you point to the person you saw?" Grace raised her small hand. Her finger extended, steady and certain, toward the back of the courtroom. Toward Thomas Landry. He was the one who held the door. He kept my mama from getting out. The explosion of sound was immediate. Reporters shouting questions. The jury erupting in confusion. Federal agents moving toward Landry, hands on their weapons. But Landry was faster. He grabbed the court officer standing next to him, a young woman named Tors, and pulled her in front of him like a shield, his service weapon pressed against her temple. Nobody move. The room froze. 12 FBI agents had their weapons drawn, but none of them had a clean shot. Tors was sobbing, her eyes wide with terror. Judge Brennan's voice was steel. "Mr. Landry, put down the weapon." "Can't do that, Your Honor. See, I've spent 12 years making sure nothing disrupted the business operations in this courthouse. And I'm not going to prison because a little girl thinks she remembers something from when she was 3. Grace hadn't moved. She stood in the center of the aisle, exposed, vulnerable. Hyung Kai strained against his chains, his face contorted with rage and helplessness. Sarah stepped forward slowly, hands raised. "Thomas, you don't want to do this. There are too many witnesses, too many cameras. You hurt that officer and there's no way out." "There's always a way out. I learned that from the best." He jerked his head toward Hyung Kai. "Dragon over there taught me everything about cleaning up messes. Funny how the student becomes the teacher." Hyung Kai's voice was cold. "I never taught you to murder children." "No, but you taught me that the only good witness is a dead one, and I've got unfinished business." His weapon shifted slightly, moving toward Grace. The FBI agents adjusted their aim, but they were too far away. Tors was still in the line of fire, and Grace was standing completely exposed. That's when Sarah did something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. She walked directly into Landry's line of sight, putting herself between him and Grace. "You want to shoot a federal prosecutor in open court, on camera, in front of a judge and jury. I want to get out of this room, and you're going to help me do it." "How?" "You're going to be my second shield. You and the girl. We walk out together, nice and slow, and nobody follows until I'm clear." Sarah's mind raced. Stall, keep him talking. Give the agents time to find an angle. "The list has 17 names. You're just one. Even if you get out of here, the rest will fall. The syndicate's finished." "The syndicate's bigger than you think. We've survived worse than one hitman's confession and a child's testimony." He pulled Tors backward toward the exit, his weapon still trained on Sarah. "Now move, or I start shooting." Grace's small voice cut through the tension. "You're scared." Landry's eyes snapped to her. "What?" The dragon man wasn't scared. The bad men with the big guns weren't scared. But you are, I can tell. "Shut up. You're scared because you know what happens to people like you in prison. The dragon man told me about it. He said the guards look the other way," he said. I said shut up. The weapon swung toward Grace. Sarah dove forward, but she was too far away. The FBI agents were shouting, moving, but they weren't fast enough. And then Hyung Kai did something that shouldn't have been possible. He wrenched his dislocated shoulder forward with enough force to snap the table's anchor bolt. The chain came free. He lunged across the courtroom, his chains dragging behind him, his body moving with the speed and precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime being dangerous. He reached Grace in 3 strides and swept her behind him, putting his body between her and Landry's gun. The shot rang out. Hyung-kai staggered but didn't fall. The bullet had caught him in the chest, center mass, but he was still standing, still shielding Grace. The FBI agents had their opening. 6 of them fired simultaneously. Landry went down hard, Tors scrambling away from his body. Sarah ran to Grace, who was pressed against Hyung-kai's legs. Her rabbit clutched so tightly the stitching was tearing. Hyung-kai dropped to his knees, blood spreading across his orange jumpsuit, but his focus stayed on the little girl. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, weakening. Grace shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You promised you'd keep me safe." "I keep my promises." Medical personnel flooded in. They tried to pull Hyung-kai away, get him on a stretcher, but he wouldn't let go of Grace. Not until Bate arrived and physically took her, wrapping the little girl in her arms. Only then did Hyung-kai allow himself to be lowered to the ground, the medics working frantically to stem the bleeding. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "You stupid, heroic idiot." "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." "Don't you die, not after everything." Hyung-kai's eyes were closing. "Tell her. Tell Grace she doesn't have to visit me in prison. Tell her she can just be a kid. Tell her yourself." They loaded him onto the stretcher and rushed him out. Judge Brennan had cleared the courtroom except for essential personnel. Federal agents were already on their phones, coordinating arrests based on Hyung-kai's list. Sarah stood in the center of the empty courtroom, blood on her hands, her heart still hammering. Grace broke free from Bate and ran back, picking up something from the floor where Hyung-kai had fallen. The coin, the one he'd given her 4 years ago. "He's going to want this back," Grace said quietly, "when he wakes up." Sarah looked at this 7-year-old girl who'd survived a massacre, stayed silent for 4 years, and then brought down an entire criminal empire with her testimony. "Yeah," Sarah said. "Yeah, he will." Outside, sirens wailed as more arrests began. The hero cop was dead. The security chief was bleeding out. And somewhere in an operating room, a reformed hitman was fighting for his life. The Dragon of Seoul had finally finished the job he'd started 4 years ago. Now he just had to survive it. The hospital waiting room smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. Sarah had been there for 6 hours, watching the clock tick past midnight, then 2 a.m., then dawn. Grace had fallen asleep on Bates' lap around 3, her rabbit tucked under her chin, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of childhood sleep. The surgery had taken 4 hours. The bullet had collapsed Hyung-kai's lung, nicked an artery, and lodged near his spine. The surgeon, a tired woman with kind eyes, had emerged just after 5 a.m. to say he'd survived. Barely, critical but stable. "He's strong," she'd said, peeling off her surgical gloves. "Stronger than he should be, given what his body's been through. But the next 72 hours will tell us if there's permanent damage." Sarah had thanked her and returned to the waiting room, where federal agents rotated shifts, guarding the hallway and news vans, multiplied in the parking lot like weeds. The arrests had started at dawn. Based on Hyung-kai's list and the evidence Sarah had compiled, the FBI had hit 17 locations simultaneously. Syndicate leaders pulled from their homes, corrupt officials taken from their offices, a network that had operated for decades dismantled in a single coordinated strike. Detective Robert Graves was in federal custody now, held without bail in a maximum security facility. The charges kept multiplying: conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, racketeering, obstruction of justice. He'd stopped talking after his lawyer arrived, but it didn't matter. David Tyler's voice from beyond the grave had already said everything the prosecutors needed. Kevin had texted around 7 a.m. Judge Brennan signed the order. All charges against Hyung-kai dismissed. He's officially a free man. Well, once he can walk. Sarah had stared at that message for a long time, processing what it meant. Cho Hyung-kai had walked into that courtroom as a monster, confessed to being a monster, and somehow emerged as something else entirely. Not innocent, not redeemed, but free. The question was, free to do what? Ms. Sarah. Grace was awake, rubbing her eyes. Her hair sticking up in directions that would have made Bate laugh if she weren't so exhausted. Hey, sweetie. Can I see him now? The doctor had said no visitors except immediate family, but Sarah had learned that rules bent when a 7-year-old girl had literally taken a bullet meant for you. She stood and held out her hand. Let's ask. They walked down the sterile hallway to the ICU, past rooms where other families kept vigil over their own crises. The guard at Hyung-kai's door, FBI, not court security, recognized Sarah and stepped aside. 5 minutes. He's awake but weak. Sarah nodded and pushed open the door. Hyung-kai looked smaller in the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped rhythmically. His tattoos seemed faded against the white sheets, the dragon on his neck partially obscured by bandages. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Grace walked to the bedside without hesitation. She reached up and placed her hand on his. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with obvious effort. When he saw Grace, something in his expression cracked, not broke, just opened. You're supposed to be in a safe house, he said, his voice rough from intubation. They said I could come, because you're not dangerous anymore. A ghost of a smile. They're optimistic. Grace climbed onto the chair beside his bed so she could see him better. She held up the coin, the one she'd picked up from the courtroom floor. You dropped this. I was hoping you'd keep it. Why? So you'd remember that promises matter, even from people like me. Grace studied the coin, turning it over in her small fingers. The dragon on here looks like the one on your neck. It's the same dragon. My grandmother gave me that coin when I was young. She said it would protect me. He paused, wincing slightly. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right to give it to you. Sarah watched from the doorway, giving them space. This moment wasn't hers. Grace set the coin on the bedside table. The news people are saying you're a hero, that you saved my life. The news people say a lot of things. Are you a hero? Hyung-kai was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. No. Heroes don't spend 4 years in prison for crimes they actually committed. Heroes don't have 17 bodies in their past. I'm just someone who finally did one right thing after a lifetime of wrong ones. That's still pretty good. He almost laughed, then stopped because it hurt too much. You're a strange kid. You're a strange dragon. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Judge Brennan. Need you back at courthouse. Sentencing hearing scheduled for 2 p.m. Sarah's stomach dropped. Sentencing. For the crimes Hyung-kai had confessed to during his testimony. The murders he'd admitted to. The 17 people he'd killed before he ever met Grace Tyler. The system didn't care that he'd saved a child. It couldn't. Justice didn't work on scales where one good deed balanced against 17 murders. Sarah stepped into the room. Grace, can you give Mr. Cho and me a minute? Grace looked between them, then nodded. I'll wait outside, but don't take too long. I want to tell him something. After she left, Sarah moved to the bedside. There's a sentencing hearing this afternoon. I know. Gerald called earlier. Tried to talk me into appealing for leniency. You should. The judge might consider. I'm not asking for leniency. Hyung-kai's voice was firm despite his weakness. I told you in that courtroom, I'm not a good man. I don't get to walk away from this. You saved Grace's life, multiple times. You brought down a corrupt network. You. I killed 17 people, Sarah. 17 families who never got justice. 17 lives I ended because someone paid me to. He closed his eyes. Grace gets to grow up free because I finally stopped being a monster for 5 seconds. That doesn't erase the 30 years I spent being one. So you're just going to go back to prison. I'm going to take responsibility. There's a difference. Sarah wanted to argue, to find some legal loophole, Some way to reward the man who'd sacrificed everything to protect a child. But looking at him now, damaged, exhausted, but somehow at peace, she realized he'd already made his choice. The FBI wants you in witness protection. After sentencing, they're worried about retaliation. From who? I named everyone. There's no syndicate left to retaliate. There are always more, you know that. Hyun-kai was quiet. Then, send Grace back in, please. Sarah nodded and stepped outside, where Grace was drawing on a notepad one of the nurses had given her. Bate was on the phone with social services, discussing long-term placement options. Your turn, Sarah said. Grace practically ran back into the room. Sarah watched through the window as the little girl climbed back onto the chair, her expression serious. They're going to send you back to prison, Grace said. I heard Miss Sarah talking on the phone. Yeah, they are. Because you hurt people before. Yes. But you stopped hurting people. You saved me. Saving one person doesn't erase hurting 17 others, Grace. That's not how it works. Grace chewed her lip, thinking. Then she pulled her rabbit into her lap and started picking at its torn ear. When I was hiding that night, when everything was on fire and I was scared, you told me something. Do you remember? Hyun-kai's expression flickered. I told you a lot of things. You said, some dragons guard treasure and some dragons become it. I didn't understand, but I think I do now. What does it mean? It means you were supposed to be scary, but you decided to be the thing that keeps people safe instead. She looked up at him with those impossibly wise eyes. You became the treasure. Something broke in Hyun-kai's face, not dramatically, just a small crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. A single tear tracked down his cheek before he could stop it. Grace reached out and wiped it away, her small hand gentle against his scarred face. I'm going to visit you, she said. In prison, every month, until you believe you're not a monster anymore. Grace. And I'm going to bring you drawings, and I'll tell you about school. And when I'm older, I'll tell you about my first job and my first boyfriend and all the things that happened because you made sure I got to grow up. Hyun-kai's hand closed over hers, careful not to hurt her. You don't owe me that. I know, but I want to. She leaned closer, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. You kept me alive for 4 years from inside a cage. Now I'm going to keep you alive from outside one. That's fair. That's not how it works. Maybe it's how it should work. They sat in silence for a moment, this unlikely pair bound together by violence and survival, and something that neither of them had words for yet. Finally, Grace spoke again. Can I tell you a secret, a real one? Always. She leaned in close, her breath tickling his ear, and whispered something Sarah couldn't hear from the doorway. Whatever Grace said made Hyun-kai close his eyes. His hand tightened around hers, and when he opened them again, they were different, lighter, like something heavy he'd been carrying for 30 years had finally been set down. Grace pulled back, satisfied. She climbed down from the chair and picked up her rabbit. I'll see you next month, don't forget. I won't forget. She walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Dragon. Yeah. Thank you for counting with me. Then she was gone, Bate collecting her from the hallway, social services waiting to take her to whatever came next. Sarah stayed behind, watching Hyun-kai stare at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. What did she tell you? Sarah asked quietly. Hyun-kai was silent for a long moment. Then, she said, my real name isn't Grace Tyler, it's Grace Cho. Because you're the only family I have left and families don't abandon each other. Sarah felt her throat tighten. She can't legally. I know, but she meant it, and that. He paused, searching for words. That's worth more than freedom. At 2 p.m., Cho Hyun-kai appeared before Judge Brennan for sentencing. He pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter on 7 counts where prosecutors could prove intent and circumstance. The other 10 remained unsolved, unproven, but acknowledged. 25 years, eligible for parole in 15. The courtroom was empty except for Sarah, federal agents, and a few reporters. No spectators, no Grace. But when the marshals led Hyung Kai out in chains, headed back to prison, he looked somehow lighter than when he'd arrived. Like the weight of 4 years of silence and secrets had finally lifted. In the hallway, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thank you for believing her. Gee." Sarah smiled and deleted the message. Then she walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sun, where Grace and Bate were waiting by a car, ready to start whatever came next. Grace waved. Sarah waved back. And somewhere behind concrete walls and razor wire, a dragon who'd spent his whole life burning things down finally learned what it meant to protect something worth saving.